Rerrick Parish Poltergeist, Scotland's forgotten bell witch. The fire had burned low. Andrew Mackie sat alone in the main room of his farmhouse at Rincroft of Stocking, in the parish of Rerrick, in the southwest of Scotland, on a February night in 1695. The wind outside came off the Solway Firth with the particular cold that coastal Scottish winters produce, wet and penetrating and absolute. Inside the farmhouse, the walls were thick stone and the fire gave what warmth it could, and the room was the kind of quiet that a man alone in a remote place on a dark night knows well. The quiet of isolation, the quiet of a world that is gone to sleep around you and left you the last one awake. He had been sitting with his thoughts. The strange things had been happening for a few weeks now. Small things at first. Objects moved. Ropes found unknotted that he was certain he had secured. A sense, impossible to articulate, of something in the building that should not be there. He had told himself it was nothing. He was a practical man, a farmer, a man whose relationship with the physical world was concrete and daily and rooted in the soil he worked. Things did not move on their own. There were explanations. He simply had not found them yet. Then the fire flared once, briefly, and in the silence that followed, something spoke his name. Not loudly. Not in the way that a person shouts across a room. Quietly, from somewhere close. From somewhere that, when he looked, contained nothing but the familiar shadows of his own home. He sat very still. It spoke again. Andrew Mackie would later describe what followed to the Reverend Alexander Telfire, minister of Rerrick Parish, who wrote it all down with the careful precision of a man who understood that what he was recording was extraordinary, and that extraordinary claims required extraordinary documentation. Telfire's account, signed by 14 witnesses and published as an official pamphlet in December 1695, is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of paranormal investigation. It is also one of the least known. What happened at Rincroft of Stocking in the winter and spring of 1695 predates the Bell Witch haunting of Tennessee by more than a century. It shares with that case a speaking entity, escalating violence, multiple independent witnesses, failed religious interventions, and a conclusion that left every person involved unable to explain what they had experienced. It was documented in real time by a minister of the church, attested to by clergy and magistrates and community members who had every reason to be cautious about associating their names with claims of the supernatural, and published within months of the events themselves, and it has been almost entirely forgotten until now. To understand what happened at Rincroft of Stocking, you need to understand the world in which it happened. Because the Scotland of 1695 was not a neutral backdrop for events of this kind. It was a country that had just emerged from one of the most traumatic periods in its history. A period of religious persecution so severe and so sustained that it had left scars on the national consciousness that were still raw when Andrew Mackie first heard his name spoken by something he could not see. The period, known as the Killing Time, had run from roughly 1679 to 1688, overlapping almost exactly with the events we have already discussed at Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh, events that were, in their own way, products of the same political and religious violence. The Covenanters, those Scottish Presbyterians who had signed the National Covenant declaring that God rather than the King was the head of the church, had been hunted, imprisoned, and executed throughout this period by government forces operating under the authority of the Stuart monarchy. Southwest Scotland, the region of Dumfries and Galloway where the parish of Rerrick was located, had been particularly badly affected. Covenanting was strong in this part of Scotland. Government repression was correspondingly fierce. The fields and hills of Galloway had been the scene of military confrontations, summary executions, and the kind of sustained terror that leaves its mark not just on the people who experience it, but on the land itself, that by 1695 the killing time was over. William of Orange had come to the throne in 1688 and restored religious freedom to Scotland. The Covenanters had survived, but the trauma of what they had endured was not simply resolved by a change of monarch. It persisted in communities throughout southwest Scotland as a living memory, a fresh wound in the culture of a region that had lost hundreds of its people to religious persecution within the lifetimes of those still living there. Andrew Mackie was a member of this community. He was a farmer and a stonemason, a practical man of modest means who worked the land at Rincroft of Stocking, a small farmstead on a hill above the village of Auchincairn in the parish of Rerrick. He lived there with his wife and children in the manner of working rural Scottish families of the period, tied to the rhythms of the agricultural year, embedded in the community of the parish, living a life whose horizons were local and whose frame of reference was shaped by the church and the land in roughly equal measure. He was not a man given to superstition or hysteria. He was not, as far as any of the contemporary records suggest, a man with an agenda or a motive for fabrication. He was simply a farmer on a hill in Galloway who began, in the early weeks of 1695, to experience things in his home that he could not explain, and that, as the weeks passed, he could no longer ignore or rationalize away. The first disturbances were exactly the kind of thing that a practical man might initially attribute to practical causes. Stones fell inside the house with no visible origin, not small pebbles, substantial stones, appearing in rooms where no stone should be, falling with a force that suggested they had been thrown. Mackie searched the house. He searched the outbuildings. He found nothing. The stones kept falling. He asked his neighbors. No one had an explanation. Then fires began starting, not in the fireplace, in the thatch of the roof, in corners of the house where no flame had been. Small localized fires that appeared without source and that Mackie would discover and extinguish before they could spread. The fires were frightening not just for their obvious danger, but for their impossibility. No candle had been near the places where they started. No ember had fallen. No conventional explanation presented itself. The fires simply appeared, burned briefly, and were put out, and then appeared again somewhere else. The household was by this point deeply frightened. Mackie's wife and children were living with the constant awareness that something was happening in their home that they had no framework to understand. The parish community was becoming aware of the disturbances. Neighbors came to witness what was being reported. Some of them were present when stones fell in rooms with no one near them. Some of them saw the fires begin. The accounts were consistent across independent witnesses who had no reason to corroborate each other's stories. It was in the weeks that followed that the haunting at Rincroft became something that no one in the parish of Rerrick had any precedent for dealing with. The entity spoke, not once, not ambiguously, repeatedly, clearly, in the presence of multiple witnesses, in a voice that the people who heard it struggled to describe in terms that their existing vocabulary could adequately capture. It was heard by Mackie. It was heard by his family. It was heard by neighbors who had come to witness the disturbances and who left having experienced something they had not expected and could not easily put aside. What the voice said varied. It issued warnings. It made demands. It called out to specific individuals by name. On several occasions, it spoke in what witnesses described as a mocking tone, as though whatever was producing the voice was aware of the fear it was creating and found that awareness satisfying. This characteristic, the sense of an intelligence behind the phenomena that was not merely active but reactive, that noticed and responded to the people around it, was one of the features of the Rerrick case that would later be identified as connecting it to other well-documented poltergeist cases, including the Bell Witch haunting that would occur in Tennessee more than a century later. The Bell Witch case, for those unfamiliar with it, is one of the most famous paranormal cases in American history. In Adams, Tennessee, beginning in the early 1800s, the Bell family reported years of harassment by an entity that spoke, sang, quoted scripture, identified itself by name, displayed apparent knowledge of events occurring at distance, and showed a particular and sustained hostility toward the family patriarch, John Bell. The case attracted enormous attention, was investigated by General Andrew Jackson, among others, and has never been satisfactorily explained. It is one of the foundational documents of American paranormal tradition. The parallels between the Bell Witch case and what was happening at Rincroft of Stocking in 1695 are striking enough that researchers who have studied both cases have noted them with considerable interest. Both involved a speaking entity. Both involved escalating physical violence directed at specific individuals. Both involved repeated failed attempts at religious intervention. Both attracted investigators and witnesses from outside the immediate family. Both generated documentation by credible individuals with professional standing in their communities, and both ended without resolution. The entity in each case eventually reducing its activity and then apparently ceasing, without any explanation being established for why it had begun or why it stopped. The Rerrick case predates the Bell Witch by well over a century. Whether the two cases share any common origin, whether they represent instances of the same type of phenomenon occurring in different contexts, or whether the parallels are coincidental, is a question that researchers have not been able to answer definitively. What is clear is that whatever was happening at Ringcroft of Stocking in 1695 was not an isolated or unprecedented type of event, even if the specific instance was unknown to the Tennessee family, who would experience something so similar more than 100 years later. Reverend Alexander Telfair came to Ringcroft of Stocking in the early spring of 1695. He was the minister of Rerrick Parish, a man of education and professional standing, and he came because it was his pastoral duty to respond to what his parishioners were reporting, and because what they were reporting was extraordinary enough that he felt it required investigation rather than dismissal. He was not a credulous man. He was not someone who arrived at Ringcroft already persuaded that something supernatural was occurring. He arrived as an investigator with the intention of establishing what was actually happening and providing what comfort and guidance he could to a family that was clearly in distress. What he found when he arrived was not what he had expected. He was present when stones fell in the house with no visible cause. He was present when fire appeared in the thatch. He was present on multiple occasions when the voice spoke in the farmhouse, not at a distance, not ambiguously, but clearly and in close proximity, addressing the people in the room directly. Telfair was a trained minister of the church, educated in the theology of his tradition, familiar with the doctrinal frameworks that the church provided for understanding claimed encounters with the supernatural. He brought those frameworks to bear on what he was experiencing at Ringcroft. He prayed, read scripture aloud. He led the household in worship and called upon whatever spiritual authority his office and his faith gave him. The entity was not particularly impressed. The disturbances continued during Telfair's visits. The voice continued to speak. The fires continued to start. The stones continued to fall. The minister found himself in the position that investigators and clergy in every well-documented paranormal case eventually find themselves confronted with phenomena that his professional and intellectual frameworks were not equipped to resolve, and with a family that was looking to him for help that he was unable to provide. He did the thing that distinguished him, and that is the reason his account has survived 3 centuries and retained its value as a historical document. He wrote everything down. Telfair single quotes his account of the events at Ringcroft of Stocking is not a dramatic embellishment or a sensationalized retelling. It is the careful, methodical documentation of a professional man recording what he observed and what was reported to him by witnesses he considered credible. He noted the dates of specific incidents. He named the witnesses who were present. He described the phenomena in specific rather than general terms. He recorded the voice in what it said with the precision of someone who understood that the words themselves were evidence. And when the events at Ringcroft finally reached their conclusion in the spring of 1695, he compiled his account and submitted it to the relevant ecclesiastical authorities in Edinburgh, who reviewed it and authorized its publication. The pamphlet was published in December 1695 under the title A True Relation of an Apparition, Expressions and Actings of a Spirit, which infested the house of Andrew Mackie in Ringcroft of Stocking in the Parish of Rerrick. It was signed by Telfair and attested to by 14 other individuals, ministers, magistrates, and respected community members who had either witnessed the events themselves or had investigated the reports and found them credible. 2 editions were printed in Edinburgh in 1696. A 3rd edition was printed in London for a case that is now almost entirely unknown. It was, at the time of its publication, considered significant enough to warrant 3 separate printings in 2 different cities. The 14 witnesses who signed Telfair's document were not doing so lightly. It is worth dwelling on this point. because it is the feature of the Rerrick case that most clearly distinguishes it from the vast majority of paranormal reports in any era. In 1695 Scotland, in the immediate aftermath of the Killing Time, putting your name to a public document about supernatural events was not a casual act. The church was the central institution of Scottish public life, and the church's relationship to claims of the supernatural was complex and consequential. Signing a sworn attestation about a poltergeist was the kind of thing that could follow a man or a minister through his professional career. The 14 people who signed Telfire's document knew this. They signed it anyway. Among the signatories were ministers of the Church of Scotland from neighboring parishes who had visited Ringcroft and witnessed the phenomena themselves. They were men whose professional credibility depended on their reputation for sober judgment and theological orthodoxy. They had no obvious incentive to associate themselves with a sensational supernatural claim. They did so because they had been present, because they had seen and heard what Telfire recorded, and because they felt that what they had witnessed was real enough and significant enough to attest it publicly. Among the signatories were also magistrates, men with legal standing and professional responsibilities that depended on their reputation for accuracy and impartiality. Magistrates. In 17th century, Scotland did not sign supernatural attestations for entertainment. They signed them when they believed the evidence warranted it. The testimony these 14 witnesses attested to included specific incidents that Cloche documented in detail. Fires appearing spontaneously in the thatch and interior of the farmhouse, witnessed by multiple people simultaneously. Stones falling inside rooms with no visible source, witnessed by visitors who had no prior connection to the Mackie family and no stake in the outcome of the investigation. The voice speaking clearly in the presence of groups of people, addressing individuals by name, demonstrating apparent knowledge of things it should not have known. One incident documented by Telfire involved the voice making specific threats that were subsequently followed by specific events. The entity told witnesses what it intended to do and then did it. This characteristic, the apparent capacity for sequential planning and follow-through, is one of the most disturbing elements of the Rerrick case and one of the features that most clearly aligns it with the Bell Witch haunting, where the entity similarly demonstrated an apparent capacity for intention and action that went beyond simple reactive violence. The attempts at religious intervention that Telfire and the other ministers made during the course of the haunting were not limited to a single visit or a single ritual. Multiple ministers attended Ringcroft over the weeks and months of the disturbance. They prayed, they read scripture, they led the household in worship and supplication. They brought the full weight of their theological tradition to bear on the situation. On several occasions, the disturbances appeared to diminish briefly during intensive periods of prayer and worship, only to resume with renewed force when the activity ceased. This pattern of temporary reduction in response to religious intervention, followed by resumption, was consistent enough that Telfire noted it as a feature of the haunting, rather than as evidence of its resolution. The entity also demonstrated what Telfire described as a particular hostility toward the acts of worship and prayer that the ministers conducted. It interrupted them. It spoke during them. It seemed to the people present to be aware of what was being done and to be responding to it, not with capitulation, but with resistance. This was not the behavior of a phenomenon that was indifferent to the people in the room. It was the behavior of something that was paying attention. The fires were perhaps the most practically terrifying aspect of the haunting. A farmhouse with a thatched roof in a period before fire services existed in a remote rural location was genuinely vulnerable to fire in a way that modern buildings are not. Every fire that appeared at Ringcroft had to be found and extinguished manually, often in the dark, often with limited water available. The fires were not large, they were small, localized, and discovered early enough each time to be controlled, but their frequency and their unpredictability created a sustained state of fear in the household that was exhausting in a way that single dramatic events are not. It was not the shock of one terrible night. It was the grinding, relentless anxiety of not knowing when the next fire would appear or where. or whether this would be the one that could not be put out in time. Mackie and his family were, by this point, living in conditions of sustained stress that would have been debilitating even if the cause had been entirely conventional. The accumulated weeks of disruption, of sleepless nights, of the awareness that something was present in their home and was actively hostile toward them had taken a visible toll. Telfair noted the condition of the family in his documentation, with the pastoral concern of someone who was genuinely distressed by what he saw. These were good people, he recorded, faithful and decent members of his parish, and what was happening to them was something that no amount of prayer or pastoral care had been able to stop. The spring of 1695 brought a gradual diminution of the activity at Rincroft. It did not stop suddenly or dramatically. It wound down over a period of weeks, the incidents becoming less frequent, the voice becoming less active, the fires appearing less often. By late spring, the disturbances had ceased, entirely, as abruptly and as mysteriously as they had begun. Mackie and his family remained at Rincroft. The farm continued to operate. Life resumed its normal pattern. Whatever had been present in the farmhouse on that windswept hill above Outkin Cairn departed, or fell silent, or simply chose to stop. The reason for its arrival and the reason for its departure were never established, and remain, 3 centuries later, entirely unknown. The site of Rincroft of Stocking no longer exists as it did in 1695. The farmhouse where Andrew Mackie and his family endured their months of terror has long since gone. The land has changed. The hill above Outcairn looks out over the same Solway Firth it always has, the same grey water stretching toward the English coast, the same coastal plain and the same sky that the Mackie family would have known. But the specific place, the farmstead itself, the rooms where the stones fell and the fires started and the voice spoke, is gone. What remains is a tree. A single twisted oak stands in a field outside Outkin Cairn, at the location of the ring plantation that once marked the site of Rincroft. It is old and gnarled and skeletal in the way of very old trees that have survived more than their share of Scottish winters. Local tradition in Outkin Cairn holds that it is the last surviving tree of a group that once stood on the site of the Mackie farmstead, and local tradition holds something else about it as well, something that people in Outkin Cairn have been saying for a long time, and that has never been resolved in either direction. When the last ghost tree dies, the Rerrick Poltergeist will return. This is not an old prophecy in any formal sense. It is a piece of local lore, the kind of statement that accumulates around locations with dark histories and persists because it articulates something that the community feels about the place without quite being able to say it in any other way. It says that whatever was at Rincroft in 1695 is not gone. It is only dormant. It is held in place by something as fragile and as temporary as a single old tree in a field. When that tree goes, the holding goes with it. The tree is still standing. As far as anyone knows, it is still there in its field above Outkin Cairn, still twisted, still enduring the coastal winds that come off the Solway Firth the way they always have, but trees do not live forever. And the people of Outkin Cairn have been watching that tree for a long time. What researchers who have studied the Rerrick case have consistently found most interesting is not the folklore that surrounds it, but the document that underlies it. Telfair's pamphlet is not a legend. It is not a retelling of events that occurred generations before it was written. It is a contemporaneous document, produced within months of the events it describes, by a professional man with a stake in its accuracy, signed by 14 people, with professional reputations that depended on their credibility, the Encyclopedia Britannica noted the Rerrick case in its coverage of poltergeist phenomena. Researchers in the late 19th and early 20th century who were cataloging and studying paranormal cases across history cited Telfair's pamphlet as one of the most significant documents of its kind from the pre-modern period. The case was considered, by those who examined it seriously, to be among the best documented paranormal events of the 17th century. And then, gradually, it was forgotten. Not because it was debunked, not because the document was found to be fraudulent or the witnesses were discredited. It was forgotten the way many things from the 17th century are forgotten, not through active dismissal, but through simple neglect, through the accumulation of time and the shifting of attention to newer and more accessible cases, the Bell Witch arrived and became famous and drew the attention that cases of this kind attract. And the Rerrick Parish Poltergeist, which had done everything the Bell Witch would later do, and done it more than a century earlier, remained in its archives in Edinburgh, signed and attested and witnessed and thoroughly ignored. The question that the Rerrick case poses most directly is also the simplest. What do you do with a document like Telfire's pamphlet? It cannot be dismissed as the work of a credulous or dishonest man without doing violence to what the historical record tells us about Telfire himself. It cannot be explained as mass hallucination or community hysteria without accounting for the specific, verifiable details it contains. The fires that left physical evidence, the stones that were found in rooms where they had no business being, the voice that was heard simultaneously by multiple independent witnesses who did not know each other and had no motive to coordinate their accounts. It cannot be explained. That is the honest answer. 3 centuries of availability and it has not been explained. Every rational framework that has been brought to bear on it has produced conclusions that account for some of the reported phenomena and fail to account for others. The document sits in its archive, signed and witnessed and published, and it remains exactly what it was in December 1695, an account of something that happened to real people in a real place, witnessed by real witnesses that no one has ever been able to satisfactorily explain. Andrew Mackie lived at Ringcroft for years after the events of 1695. He did not leave. He did not seek to profit from what had happened. It had not become a public figure or a speaker on the paranormal circuit of his era. He was a farmer and a stonemason, and he went back to being those things when whatever had occupied his home finally decided to leave. His name is attached to one of the most extraordinary documented paranormal events in Scottish Times history, and he did nothing to make it so except live in his house and experience what happened there and tell the truth about it to a minister who wrote it down. Reverend Telfire published his pamphlet and continued to serve as minister of Rerrick until his death in 1732. He did not retract what he had written. He did not moderate his account in the years that followed as the initial public interest faded. He had written what he witnessed and what 14 other people had witnessed with him, and he stood by it. The 14 witnesses who signed the document lived out their lives in the parishes of southwest Scotland. Their names are in the archive. Their attestations are on the page. They said what they saw, and they put their names to it, and they did not take those names back. Whatever was at Ringcroft of stalking in 1695, whatever spoke from the darkness of a farmhouse on a hill above out in Cairn in the worst of a Scottish winter, whatever threw the stones and started the fires and called out to the people in the house by name, it left when it was ready to leave, not when the prayers started, not when the ministers arrived, not when the community rallied around the Mackie family with all the spiritual and practical resources it could bring to bear when it was ready and in a field outside Auchencairn, on the site where it once made a family's life impossible. A single old tree is still standing, for now. To truly understand what the Rerrick Parish Poltergeist means, what it represents in the broader history of documented paranormal phenomena, you need to sit with the specific incidents that Telfire recorded in more detail than the summary account allows, because the pamphlet is not a collection of vague impressions. It is a chronicle of specific events on specific dates, witnessed by specific people, and the specificity is what gives it its extraordinary evidential weight. When you read the original document, or the scholarly accounts that have drawn on it, what strikes you most forcefully is not the supernatural content, it is the granular, almost bureaucratic precision with which a 17th century Scottish minister recorded things that had no place in his theological or rational framework. Telfire noted the date of the first disturbances as February 1695. The early incidents, as he recorded them, were exactly the kind of thing that a practical man might initially attribute to practical causes. Stones appearing inside the house, not outside, where their presence would be unremarkable, but inside, in rooms where no stones should be, found after sounds of impact that witnesses described as the sound of something being thrown with considerable force. Mackie searched for conventional explanations. He found none. The stones kept arriving. What made the stone incidents particularly significant to Telfire? And what made them significant to the investigators who reviewed the case in later centuries was their specificity. The stones that appeared inside the farmhouse were not random debris. They were found in locations and under circumstances that made conventional explanations, someone throwing them through a window, some structural failure, releasing them from the walls, extremely difficult to sustain. Witnesses who were present in the rooms when the sounds occurred, who had clear sight lines across the entire space, reported seeing no source. The stones simply arrived from nowhere. Telfair documented one incident in particular that he found especially difficult to account for. A stone appeared in a room that had been closed and occupied, a room in which Telfair himself was present, along with several other witnesses, all of whom had been in the room continuously and none of whom had seen or heard anything that could explain the stone's arrival. It was simply there, on the floor, where it had not been moments before, and no one in the room could explain how it had got there. He wrote it down. He did not embellish it. He noted that he could not explain it, and recorded precisely what he had observed. The fire incidents followed a pattern that Telfair also documented with considerable care. They occurred primarily in the thatch, the dry grass and reed roofing material that covered rural Scottish farmhouses of the period, and that was, as Telfair noted, extremely vulnerable to fire. The fires were always small when discovered, always localized, always in places where no conventional ignition source had been present. And they occurred with a frequency that Telfair and the Mackie family found terrifying, not because of any single incident, but because of the accumulated weight of their repetition. A single unexplained fire can be rationalized. A second can strain credulity, but still be accommodated within a conventional framework. A third and a fourth and a fifth, all occurring in circumstances that rule out conventional explanations and witness by people who had specifically positioned themselves to observe and rule out fraud. That accumulation becomes something else entirely. Telfair recorded each fire individually with the date and the location and the witnesses present. And the record he produced was not a catalog of dramatic events, but something quieter and in some ways more disturbing, evidence of a sustained, patient, persistent presence that was making its existence known through repetition rather than spectacle. It was the voice that changed everything. Not for the witnesses who heard it, though it changed everything for them too, but for the historical significance of the case. Poltergeist cases involving thrown objects and unexplained fires are relatively well documented across history. Cases involving an entity that speaks clearly in front of multiple independent witnesses, in a way that demonstrates apparent intelligence and apparent awareness of its audience. Those are extraordinarily rare. Telfair was careful in how he recorded the voice. He did not describe it in terms that suggested he was certain of its supernatural origin. He described what he heard and what the other witnesses reported hearing, and he noted, with the precision of a man trained to be precise, that what they heard did not correspond to anything in the room that could account for it. There was no person present who could have been producing the sound. There was no mechanical or structural explanation that any of the people present could identify. The voice came from somewhere within the farmhouse, and it addressed the people in the room directly, and it said things that the people who heard it did not forget. What did it say? The voice issued warnings. On multiple occasions, it told the people in the house that what they were currently experiencing was not the worst of what was coming, that the disturbances would intensify before they ceased. This proved accurate. The activity at Rincroft did escalate over the weeks following the first vocal incidents, before eventually diminishing in the spring. Whether this represents genuine predictive capacity on the part of the entity or simply reflects the natural trajectory of poltergeist activity in documented cases, an escalation followed by diminution is a question that cannot be answered definitively. But the witnesses who heard those warnings and then watched the activity intensify exactly as predicted were not people who took the correspondence lightly. The voice also identified itself, not clearly, not in a way that gave the investigators a name they could attach to a specific historical person or event, but it communicated something about its nature and its purpose that Tellfire recorded carefully and that subsequent researchers have found significant. It suggested that it had a reason to be there, that its presence at Rincroft was not random, that something connected it to the place or the people or both. What that connection was, what could connect a disembodied voice in a 17th century Scottish farmhouse to the family who lived there, was never established. But the suggestion of purposefulness, of intelligence directing itself toward a specific location for a specific reason, was consistent with what the witnesses reported throughout the haunting. The ministers who gathered at Rincroft over the weeks and months of the disturbance were not a credulous group. They were educated men of the church, trained in theology, familiar with a tradition of discernment that the Christian church had developed over centuries for evaluating claims of supernatural phenomena. They brought to Rincroft a combination of genuine pastoral concern for the Mackie family and genuine investigative rigor about what was actually happening there. They were not looking for a supernatural explanation. They were looking for the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. What they found was consistent across multiple independent visits by multiple ministers from different parishes. The phenomena were real in the sense that they were occurring. They were witnessed by sober, credible people under conditions that made fraud and misperception difficult to sustain as explanations. And they resisted every spiritual intervention that the ministers brought to bear on them with a consistency that was itself remarkable, not because the interventions were ineffective in a spectacular way, but because they were ineffective in a quiet, patient way that suggested the entity was simply indifferent to them. That indifference, that patient, unhurried resistance to everything the community could bring against it, is perhaps the most chilling feature of the Rerrick case. It was not impressed. It was not frightened. It was not moved by the prayers or the scripture readings or the presence of ordained ministers conducting their most solemn rites. It simply continued at its own pace, doing what it had been doing since February and waited for whatever it was waiting for. The comparison between the Rerrick Parish Poltergeist and the Bell Witch haunting of Tennessee deserves to be examined with more care than the casual observation that the two cases share surface similarities. They share structural similarities that are specific enough to be remarkable. The Bell Witch case began in the early 1800s on the farm of John Bell in Adams, Tennessee. The Bell family reported disturbances that began with knocking and scratching sounds as escalated over a period of years to include a speaking entity, a voice that was heard by multiple witnesses that demonstrated apparent knowledge of events occurring at a distance, that quoted scripture, that sang hymns, and that showed a particular and sustained hostility toward John Bell specifically, ultimately being held by many who studied the case to have been responsible for his death. The case attracted investigators of considerable standing, including General Andrew Jackson, who visited the Bell farm and reportedly left shaken by what he experienced there. It was documented by contemporaries and studied by subsequent researchers and has never been satisfactorily explained. It remains one of the most famous paranormal cases in American history and has generated a literature of books, documentaries, films, and investigations that continues to grow. Now compare that to Rincroft of stalking. In 1695, the Rerrick case began with knocking and unexplained sounds and escalated to include a speaking entity heard simultaneously by multiple witnesses. The entity demonstrated apparent awareness of the people around it and appeared to have a specific purpose or connection to the location. Multiple ministers attended and conducted religious interventions that failed to stop the activity. The case was documented by contemporaries and signed by 14 witnesses of professional standing. It ended without explanation, the activity diminishing and then ceasing of its own accord. The structural parallels are not merely superficial. They extend to specific details that researchers have found difficult to attribute to coincidence. Both entities spoke. Both demonstrated apparent intelligence. Both resisted religious intervention. Both escalated before diminishing. Both were documented by contemporaries with standing in their communities. Both ended without resolution. The Rerrick case predates the Bell Witch by more than a century. The Tennessee family could not have known about Tellfire's pamphlet. It was published in Edinburgh in 1696, and the American editions that might have reached colonial audiences were not widely circulated. The parallel is not a case of one story influencing another. It is two independent accounts of remarkably similar phenomena occurring in different countries, in different centuries, within different cultural and religious contexts, producing documentation that shares specific structural and behavioral features. What does that mean? Researchers who have studied poltergeist cases across history have noted that certain features recur with a consistency that transcends cultural and geographical context. The escalation pattern, beginning with minor disturbances and building to more dramatic phenomena before diminishing, appears in documented cases from medieval Europe to 20th century England to 19th century America. The targeting of specific individuals within a household appears repeatedly. The response to religious intervention, temporary reduction followed by resumption, appears repeatedly. The speaking entity, while rarer, appears in enough documented cases to be considered a feature of a specific subcategory of poltergeist phenomenon, rather than a unique aberration. The Rerrick case and the Bell Witch case both fall within this subcategory. They are, among documented cases of this type, two of the most thoroughly attested and most resistant to conventional explanation. And the fact that one predates the other by more than a century in a different country with no plausible cultural transmission between them is either a very significant coincidence or evidence of something about the nature of these phenomena that we do not yet have adequate frameworks to understand. The honest position. The position that the evidence actually supports is that we do not know what happened at Ringcroft of Stocking in 1695. We know that it was documented by a credible man with professional standing, witnessed by 14 people who signed a sworn document published within months of the events themselves and has never been convincingly debunked. We know that what was reported there shares specific features with documented cases from other countries and other centuries in ways that resist simple explanation. We know that the community of Rerrick Parish experienced something that frightened them profoundly, and that their minister felt compelled to write down and publish because he believed it was too significant and too well attested to be left unrecorded. And we know that the tree is still standing, the last ghost tree of Auchencairn, twisted and old in its field above the Solway Firth, marking a site where something happened 330 years ago that 14 men signed their names to, and no one has ever fully explained. The local tradition holds that when it falls, whatever waited at Ringcroft will return. Whether that tradition encodes genuine knowledge about the nature of what occurred there, or whether it is simply the way the communities give shape and boundary to the things they fear, is a question that the tree itself cannot answer. What can be said is this: Andrew Mackie heard his name spoken by something in the dark, in his farmhouse on a February night in 1695. He told his minister came and heard it too. 14 people signed a document saying they had witnessed what was happening. The document was published and has survived 3 centuries in the archives. The thing that spoke is gone, or dormant, or waiting. The document remains. And sometimes in the history of the unexplained, a document is all we have. A piece of paper with 14 names on it, written in the hand of a man who knew what he was attesting to and chose to attest to it. Anyway, Telfire signed it in Edinburgh in December 1695. The tree is still standing for now.